Camilla's life was a constant race against time. At just 22, she was about to graduate from university, but her path had not been easy. Coming from a humble family, she had worked tirelessly to pay for her studies. In the mornings, he attended his classes, always with his head full of worries about how he would pay for the next month's tuition. In the afternoons, she became a waitress in a small cafe, and in the evenings she sat in her room, exhausted, fighting sleep as she reviewed notes and prepared for exams. Her days were a never-ending routine, a cycle of sacrifices that seemed to have no end. Yet despite all the hardships, Camilla always carried a smile with her. She had learned to find beauty in the little things, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, the laughter of her classmates, the warmth of the sun at the end of a tiring afternoon. It was this optimism that kept her going, that gave her the strength to carry on, even when the world seemed to weigh more than she could bear. In a very different corner of the city, Paulo was living a completely different reality. In his 30s, he had lost everything he had ever had. An accident left him unemployed, and little by little, he was falling into an abyss from which he did not know how to escape. Friends and family who had once promised him help drifted away, and he ended up on the streets, alone and helpless. Every night he huddled in a cold corner, covered by old blankets that barely protected him from the wind, wondering how he had got to this point. Paulo's face reflected the weariness of years spent on the street. His eyes, which had once been full of dreams and hopes, were now dull, as if life had ceased to have meaning. Every day was a struggle to find something to eat, to find a place to shelter from the cold and the indifference of those who passed him by without even looking at him. It was on an ordinary day, one that could have gone unnoticed, that Camilla and Paulo's paths crossed. Camilla, carrying her backpack full of books and a coffee in her hand, was walking quickly towards the university, trying to get to an important class on time. Suddenly, she saw Paulo sitting on the pavement, his head down, his face covered in dust and sadness. Something about him caught her attention, something that made her stop, if only for a second. Paulo looked up, surprised that anyone had stopped to look at him. He was used to being invisible, to people walking around him as if he didn't exist. But Camilla's eyes met his, and in that instant, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Humanity. Camilla reached into her pocket and found a few coins, the change she had left after buying her coffee. She could have kept it for herself. She could have kept walking. But instead, she leaned over and handed the money to Paulo. "It's not much," she said with a soft smile, "but I hope it helps." Paulo looked at her, incredulous, not knowing how to react. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice cracking with emotion. Those coins represented much more than money to him. They were a reminder that there was still good in the world, that he was not completely alone. Camilla nodded and, with a last glance, continued on her way, unaware that this small gesture would change both their lives forever. As he walked away, Paulo clenched the coins in his hand and put them in his pocket, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. And it was at that moment that, without realizing it, the spark of hope ignited within him. Camilla couldn't stop thinking about that man in the street. Something in his eyes had awakened in her a sense of sadness and hope at the same time, as if they were connected by an invisible thread. Despite her hectic routine, she couldn't help but take the same route every day, hoping to meet him again. Maybe it was the desire to check that he was okay, or maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, she felt that her small gesture had made a difference. A week later, on a cold October morning, Camilla was walking to the university, her mind full of worries about an upcoming exam. She was so distracted that she didn't see the puddle in front of her and stumbled, spilling the coffee in her hand. Frustrated, she bent down to pick up her things when, suddenly, she felt someone approaching. "Are you all right?" asked a gruff but familiar voice. Camilla looked up and, to her surprise, it was Paulo. His face was covered with the same untidy beard and his clothes were still dirty, but there was something different about him. His eyes no longer seemed so dull. There was a spark that wasn't there the last time she saw him. Camila smiled, surprised that he remembered her face among the many people who passed around him every day. "Yes, I'm fine, thank you," he replied as he finished gathering his belongings. "And you, how have you been?" Paulo shrugged as if his situation was no big deal. "I've had better days, but I've also had worse days." He paused and took out of his jacket pocket a small bag with some coins and crumpled banknotes. "I wanted to thank you for what you did the other time. You didn't have to help me, but you did, and that means more than you know." Camila was speechless. She never thought her small gesture would have such an impact. "It was nothing. I just thought that," she tried to say, but Paulo interrupted her. "No, it was too much for me." Her voice trembled slightly, as if she was fighting back tears. "It was the first time in years that someone treated me like I mattered." Camila's eyes filled with tears as she heard those words. She knew life could be hard, but she never imagined that a simple show of kindness could have such a profound effect on someone. "I'm glad to hear you're okay," she finally said, trying to control her emotions. "We all deserve a little hope once in a while." Paulo watched her for a few seconds, as if he wanted to engrave every detail of her face in his memory. "I hope we can see each other again," he said with a hint of hope in his voice. "I'd like to be able to thank you someday for real." Camila smiled, feeling something inside her soften. "I'll be over here," he replied, and in that moment, they both felt that their paths, though different, had intertwined in a way they could not explain. As he walked away, Camila couldn't help but turn one last time, and there was Paulo, watching her with the same intensity. Their gazes met, and in that instant, she knew that this encounter had not been by chance. There was something else, something that united them, something that time would reveal. Camila could not stop thinking about her brief encounter with Paulo. The image of his eyes, full of gratitude and suffering, haunted her day and night. One day, while walking to the university, she decided to pass by the same street where she had seen him for the first time. She felt an inexplicable need to know if he was all right, if he had managed to find a little comfort in the midst of his difficult situation. When she arrived, she found him sitting in the same spot, his eyes vacant and his face marked by fatigue. Without a second thought, she approached him, holding a bag of food she had bought on her way to the university. "I know this isn't much, but I hope it helps," she said, holding out the bag with a warm smile. Paulo looked at her in disbelief. He wasn't used to people stopping to talk to him, let alone offering him something so kindly. "You don't have to do this," he replied, his voice full of astonishment. "You've helped me before, and I can do it again," replied Camila, in a tone that brooked no argument. "No one should go hungry." For a moment, Paulo didn't know what to say. He clutched the bag of food to his chest as if it were a treasure, as if it were the first gesture of kindness he had received in years. "Thank you," she whispered, lowering her eyes to hide the tears that threatened to escape. "You don't know how much this means to me." Camila sat down next to him, ignoring the curious glances of people passing by. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "We all need a little help now and then." For the first time in a long time, Paulo felt he could talk to someone without being judged. "I lost my job years ago," he began, his voice cracking. "Then my house, my friends, everything disappeared. And before I knew it, I was alone, stuck on the street, not knowing how to move on." Camila listened attentively, without interrupting, allowing him to release the weight on his soul. "It must have been very difficult," she finally said, trying to imagine the extent of his suffering. "It was," Paulo admitted, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "But the hardest thing wasn't losing everything. It was losing hope, feeling that no one cared about me, that I was invisible to the world." Camila felt a lump in her throat and, for a moment, didn't know what to say. "You are not invisible," he replied, taking her hand and squeezing it gently. "I see you. And even though I can't change your past, I want you to know that you are not alone." The sincerity in Camila's voice broke down the barriers Paulo had erected over the years. He had never imagined that someone, a stranger, could make him feel so valuable, so human. "Thank you," he repeated, looking directly into her eyes. Thank you for giving me back hope." That was the beginning of something they both couldn't quite understand, but which they knew was important. In the midst of adversity, they had found a small ray of light, a spark that ignited the possibility of a new beginning. And although neither of them knew what the future held for them, in that moment, sitting on the pavement, sharing the first words of a friendship that would change their lives forever, they understood that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness are the ones that leave the deepest traces. Winter came, and with it, the cold became more intense, as if the whole city was covered by a blanket of ice that froze not only the streets, but also the hearts of those who lived there. Camila went about her daily routine, busy with university exams and the job that paid for her studies. However, despite her busy life, she couldn't stop thinking about Paulo, about how he would be facing this cruel winter. One day, when Camila was returning from university, she passed by the same place where she always found Paulo, but he was not there. She waited a few minutes, hoping to see him appear, but the bench was empty. Days passed, and Paulo did not return. Uncertainty began to take hold of her, and the feeling that something was wrong grew with each passing day. Paulo, meanwhile, had fallen into one of the darkest moments of his life. The cold was relentless, and finding shelter had become an impossible challenge. With no money, no friends, and nowhere to shelter, he spent several nights outdoors, feeling the hope that Camila had kindled in him begin to fade. Every gust of icy wind reminded him that he was alone, that the world seemed to have forgotten him once again. One night, after days of aimless wandering, Paulo collapsed in an alley, his body shivering with cold and exhaustion. The shadows of the night surrounded him, and for the first time in a long time, he thought perhaps it was better to let go, to surrender to the cruel fate that had brought him there. Tears began to well up in his eyes, freezing before they reached his cheeks, and in his mind, the image of Camila appeared like a last ray of light. He remembered her words, her smile, the way she had looked at him as if he really mattered, as if his life had a value he had already forgotten. And it was at that moment that with what little strength he had left, he decided he couldn't give up. Not after all he had felt, not after someone like Camila had shown him that there was still good in the world. Meanwhile, Camila couldn't get the idea that something bad had happened out of her head. One afternoon, after work, she decided to go looking for him. She walked around every corner of the city, asking other homeless people if they had seen him, if they knew anything about him. Despair began to take hold of her, and for the first time, she felt the weight of what it meant to lose someone she didn't even know she had found. Finally, one night, as he wandered the deserted streets, he saw him. Paulo was sitting on the ground, leaning against the wall of an abandoned building, covered with an old, dirty blanket that barely protected him from the cold. Camila ran to him, and seeing him so vulnerable, so broken, she couldn't stop the tears from welling up in her eyes. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you come back?" Paulo looked at her, surprised that someone had come looking for him, and his heart filled with a warmth he had forgotten. "I didn't want you to see me like this," he answered hoarsely. "I didn't want you to know how hard it has been." Camila hugged him tightly, ignoring the cold around them. "You don't have to go through this alone," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Never again." And there, in the middle of the darkness, surrounded by the silence of the night, Camila and Paulo clung to each other, as if their souls had met at the most difficult moment, in the most unexpected place. And although life had been hard on them, although the future remained uncertain, in that instant, they both knew that they were not alone, that they had someone who was willing to fight by their side. 5 long years passed since that night when Camila embraced Paulo in the dark and cold alley. Life went on for her, although she could never forget the man she had met on the streets, the man whose gaze, full of pain and hope, had left an indelible mark on her heart. After graduating, Camila found a good job in a company, and although she managed to stabilize her life, there was always a part of her that wondered what had become of Paulo, if he had managed to find his way. if he had been able to move forward. One evening, after a tiring day at the office, Camila decided to go for dinner at a fancy restaurant that her colleagues had recommended. She needed a moment to disconnect, to forget about the stress of work, at least for a few hours. She settled herself at a table near the window and began to look at the menu, absorbed in her thoughts, when suddenly she heard a voice that sounded strangely familiar. "May I recommend the dish of the house, miss?" said the voice in a warm, confident tone. Camila looked up, and what she saw took her breath away. There, in front of her, dressed in an impeccable suit and with a smile that hadn't changed at all, was Paulo. For an instant, she thought she was dreaming. It couldn't be him. It couldn't be the same man she had met years ago in the street, the man who had fought against cold and despair. But there he was, standing in front of her, with a look that reflected all the strength and determination he had always had, even in his worst moments. "Paulo," Camila whispered, unable to stop her eyes from filling with tears. He smiled, and in that smile was the answer to all the questions she hadn't had the courage to ask. "Camila, it's been a long time," he replied softly as he sat down opposite her. "I never imagined I'd find you here." Camila couldn't take her eyes off him, trying to understand how it was possible that the man she had met in the street was now there, dressed like a successful executive in a fancy restaurant. "What happened to you?" he finally asked, his voice trembling. "How did you manage to get by?" Paulo took a deep breath, as if recalling every step that had led him to that moment. "It wasn't easy," he began. "After that night you found me in the alley, I decided I couldn't go on like that. Your gesture of kindness was the spark that ignited something in me, something I thought I had lost forever: hope." Camila listened to him attentively, as if every word was a thread connecting her to him, as if she was rediscovering the man she had known so long ago. "I found a temporary job in a small shop," Paulo continued. "It was little, but it allowed me to save enough money to rent a small room. During the evenings, I studied in the public library, trying to recover the knowledge I had lost during all those years on the street." Camila's eyes filled with pride as she heard the determination in Paulo's voice. "One day, I met a man who became my mentor," he continued. "He taught me about investments and how to manage money. It was thanks to him that I was able to start my own business. It was difficult at first, but over time, I started to succeed. And here I am now, 5 years later, owning this restaurant." The tears that Camila had been holding back finally fell down her cheeks. She couldn't believe that the man she had seen at his most vulnerable was now standing in front of her, a successful businessman. "I'm so proud of you, Paulo," she said, her voice cracking. "I never stopped believing you could do it." Paulo looked at her tenderly and took her hand, the same hand he had held on that cold and lonely night. "And it was thanks to you, Camila," he replied, "because at the moment when I had the least hope, you gave me the strength to go on. I will never forget what you did for me." Camila smiled, feeling her heart fill with warmth, and in that instant, she knew that this reunion was no coincidence. It was fate that had somehow guided them back to each other, to show them that sometimes the smallest gestures can change someone's life forever. Sitting at that table in the elegant restaurant, Camila couldn't take her eyes off Paulo. The surprise of seeing him after so many years, so different and yet so familiar, filled her with a mixture of emotions that were hard to describe. Paulo, realizing that she needed answers, took a sip of water and let out a deep sigh, as if he was about to unearth a past he had kept hidden for a long time. "There are many things I never told you, Camila," he began, his voice charged with emotion. "My life wasn't always easy. Before we met, I had a job, a house, even a family that loved me. But one bad business deal, one error in judgment, and I lost it all. From one day to the next, I found myself on the street, with nothing and no one to turn to." Camila listened attentively, her heart shrinking with every word. "It was at that moment that I understood how fragile life can be," Paulo continued, his eyes wandering to some distant point in the past. "I spent months wandering around the city, feeling myself sinking deeper and deeper into an abyss from which there was no escape. Every day was a battle, not just against the cold and hunger, but against myself, against the hopelessness that consumed me. Camila's eyes filled with tears, and she had to try hard not to let them fall. She couldn't imagine the pain Paulo had endured, the loneliness he had felt all that time. "But then you came along," he said, looking at her with an intensity that made everything around him disappear. "When you gave me that little ticket and spoke to me with such kindness, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope." "It was just a small gesture," Camila whispered, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of the impact it had had on her life. "But for me, it was a ray of light in the darkness. It was the spark I needed to keep going, to not give up." From that day on, I decided I couldn't go on living like that. I started to look for work, to do anything that would allow me to earn a little money. I slept in hostels, I worked at whatever, but I never stopped remembering you, and the fact that someone, in this cold and indifferent world, had believed that I deserved a second chance. Camila felt her heart fill with pride and admiration for Paulo. She knew he had been a strong man, but hearing his story and the way he had struggled to rebuild his life touched her deeply. "Eventually, I managed to find a stable job," Paulo continued. "It wasn't much, but it allowed me to rent a small flat and start saving. It was then that I met a man called Roberto, who became my mentor. He taught me about investments and finance, and thanks to him, I was able to start building something from scratch." "And that's how you got here?" asked Camila, still trying to process everything she had heard. Paulo nodded. "Yes, but it wasn't easy. There were days when I thought about giving up, about giving it all up and going back to the street. But every time I felt I couldn't go on, I thought of you, of that moment when you offered me your help without expecting anything in return. And that gave me the strength to go on." Camila could no longer hold back her tears and let them fall freely. She realized that, despite all the time that had passed, she had always felt a connection with Paulo, an invisible bond that had kept them together. "You're amazing, Paulo," she said, her voice cracking. "What you've achieved, the way you've picked yourself up, it's more than anyone could ever imagine." Paulo took her hand and squeezed it gently. "I couldn't have done it without you, Camila. And now that I am here, I want you to know that I will not let you go, because thanks to you, I discovered that even in the deepest darkness, there is always a guiding light." The days that followed the reunion at the restaurant became a whirlwind of emotions for Camila and Paulo. They couldn't help looking at each other, anxious to know more about each other, as if the years of separation had fueled an irrepressible desire to make up for lost time. They began to see each other more frequently, no longer as two strangers that fate had crossed paths by chance, but as two souls that, in some way, had always belonged to each other. Paulo took her to the places he had discovered on his way to rebuilding his life. He showed her the small park where he used to sit and think about his dreams when he had nothing, the cafes he visited to look for work, and the corners of the city that had seen him fight his own demons. Each of those places had a story, and Camila listened attentively, feeling that Paulo's every word was another piece of the puzzle that made him the man she had in front of her. One afternoon, as they walked along the beach, the cold wind caressing their faces, Paulo stopped and looked at her with an intensity that made Camila's heart race. "I always dreamed of having someone by my side," he confessed, his voice full of emotion. "Someone who believed in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself. And now that you're here, I feel like it all finally makes sense." Camila felt a tear slide down her cheek, but did nothing to stop it. "I dreamed of finding someone like you too," she replied, leaning closer to him. "Someone who would show me that, even in the darkest of times, there is always a reason to go on." Paulo hugged her tightly, and in that moment, Camila knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Months passed, and with each day they shared, the love between them grew, becoming stronger, deeper, as if the roots of their relationship were clinging to the soil of their past, nourished by all the experiences that had brought them to that moment. However, it was not all easy. Paulo still bore the scars of his life on the streets. and there were nights when he would wake up startled, reliving memories of the days when he had nothing. Camila, for her part, grappled with her own fears, fearful that it was all a dream that would vanish at any moment. But instead of driving them apart, those fears brought them closer together. They supported each other, held each other in moments of weakness, and together they found a way to heal the wounds that life had left them with. One night, while they were having dinner in Camila's small flat, Paulo took her hand and looked into her eyes. "I never thought I could feel this again," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "But you brought me back to life." Camila smiled and without looking away replied, "And you taught me that true love is not perfect. It is the one that is built day by day, facing fears and insecurities, but always choosing to stay." Paulo kissed her with a gentleness that made her feel that at last, all the pieces of her life were in place. No matter the obstacles, the struggles, or the pain they had both experienced. At that moment, there was only the two of them, sharing a love that had been born in the most unlikely circumstances, but which, against all odds, had blossomed. Every day, every laugh shared, every tear shed, only strengthened the bond that united them. Camila discovered in Paulo a man who had not only survived adversity, but who had transformed his pain into strength. And Paulo found in Camila the peace he had sought for so long, the certainty that he had finally found the person he wanted to share his life with. And so, between caresses, whispered words, and glances that said more than any sentence, the love between Camila and Paulo continued to grow, proving that sometimes the deepest connections are born from the deepest wounds, and that true love is not the one that never stumbles, but the one that, despite everything, always finds a way to get up. Over time, the love between Camila and Paulo continued to grow, but like a rosebush in bloom, it also brought with it thorns. Paulo, despite his success, still carried with him the weight of his past. The nights he had slept on the streets, the feeling of being invisible to the world, still haunted him in his dreams. There were times when, looking in the mirror, he saw not the man who had succeeded against all odds, but the beggar he used to be. And that terrified him. One night, after a romantic dinner, while Camila was making coffee in the kitchen, Paulo stood in the living room, looking at the photographs she had put up on the walls. There was one of them on the beach, another in the park where they used to walk, and a final one that caught his eye. It was of Camila at her graduation ceremony, with the most radiant smile he had ever seen. At that moment, a wave of insecurity hit him. What did he have to offer such a wonderful woman? What was he, a man who had hit rock bottom, doing next to someone who deserved the whole world? Camila, who had noticed Paulo's pensive expression, approached him and handed him a cup of coffee. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, in that tone that always managed to calm his inner storms. Paulo nodded, though he knew he could no longer hide his fears. "Sometimes I wonder if I really deserve to be with you," he admitted, looking down. "There are days when I feel like the man I was is still there, inside me, waiting to ruin everything." Camila set the cup aside and took his hand, entwining her fingers with his. "You are so much more than your past, and what I see in you is someone who fought to get here, someone who didn't give up, even when everything was against him. But what if one day you realize that you deserve better?" Paulo asked, unable to hold back the tears that were building up in his eyes. "What if one day you realize that I'm not enough?" Camila felt her heart break at the sight of Paulo so vulnerable, so full of doubt. She hugged him tightly, as if by doing so she could erase each of the scars that tormented him. "It's not about being enough, Paulo," she whispered. "It's about choosing us every day, despite our fears, despite our insecurities. And I choose you, again and again, because you are the man I love, and nothing will ever change that." But as they faced Paulo's insecurities, doubts also arose in Camila's heart. Despite her love, there were times when she wondered whether they could really build a future together, if Paulo's past would not be a shadow that would follow them forever. She worried about the way he withdrew quietly at times, as if he was struggling with something he couldn't share with her. And she feared that, at some point, that internal struggle would lead him to pull away again. One afternoon, while walking through the city, Camila decided to face her own fears. What if one day everything changes? He asked suddenly, stopping in the middle of the pavement. What if the past comes back and we can't face it? Paulo looked at her, surprised by her question. I don't know, he admitted, moving closer to her and taking her face in his hands. But there is one thing I do know, and that is that I don't want to face any of this without you. You are my anchor, Camila. You're the reason I keep fighting. Camila felt tears blurring her vision and nodded, feeling for the first time her doubts fade a little. Then, let's move on, she said with a smile that hid the pain she still felt. Whatever happens, we'll face everything together. And so, with doubts and fears still present, but with love stronger than ever, Paulo and Camila continued on their way, knowing that the real test was not love itself, but the ability to choose it, even when the shadows of the past threatened to separate them. Because in the end, the love that is worth it is the one that faces the storms and grows stronger with every battle. The weight of fears and insecurities had become almost unbearable for Paulo. Every night, as Camila slept beside him, he found himself trapped in his thoughts, reliving the darkest moments of his past and wondering if he could ever let go of the chains that bound him to those memories. And it was during one of those nights that Paulo realized something. If he wanted to build a future with Camila, if he really wanted to offer her the love she deserved, he would have to face his demons. He would have to show her the most vulnerable and broken part of himself. One afternoon, he decided to invite Camila to a place that was sacred to him, the small alley where years ago she had first met and embraced him. As they walked there, Paulo could feel the knot in his stomach grow bigger and bigger. He had thought about this moment so many times, how the words would choke in his throat, how the tears would threaten to spill, but he knew he had to do it. He knew that if he wanted to build a true love with Camila, he had to be completely honest, hiding nothing. When they reached the alley, Camila looked at him curiously. Why are we here? She asked softly, noticing the tension in Paulo's face. He took a deep breath and looked around, taking in the weathered walls and shadows that surrounded him. This is the place where I first gave up, he confessed, his voice trembling. It was here that I felt my life had no more meaning, that there was no reason to go on. And it was in this very place that you appeared, Camila. It was you who gave me the hope I needed to get back on my feet. Camila listened in silence, her eyes filled with tears as Paulo continued to speak. What I never told you, he said, the pain reflected in every word, is that there were nights when I thought I couldn't stand another day, that I had become someone who didn't deserve to be loved, someone who didn't deserve a second chance. And yet, in spite of everything, you found me. You saw me when no one else did. Camila took a step towards him and took his hand, as if to give him all the strength he needed to continue. Paulo, you don't have to carry that weight alone, she whispered. I'm here with you. I always will be. But that's what scares me the most, Paulo replied, tears finally falling down his cheeks. What if one day you find out that I'm not the man you think I am? What if one day you realize that I'm just a broken man trying to find his way? Camila hugged him tightly, feeling Paulo's body tremble against hers. I don't want a perfect man, Paulo, he said firmly. I want someone who is real, who has scars, who has struggled and who has fallen, but who has had the courage to get up again. Because that's what makes you strong. That's what makes you incredible. Paulo looked at her, and in that moment he knew that Camila didn't see him as a broken man. She saw someone who had fought against adversity and had found the courage to face his fears. Camila, he tried to say, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, he hugged her with all his might, as if by doing so he could seal the promise that he would always be by her side. And it was in that embrace, in that moment of absolute vulnerability and sincerity, that Paulo understood that true love was not the one that promised a perfect life. It was the one that had the courage to face fears, to accept scars and to move forward, even when uncertainty clouded the path. and with Camila by his side, Paulo knew that, for the first time, he was not alone in that struggle. The days that followed Paulo's confession in the alley were filled with a mixture of silences, deep looks, and a love that seemed stronger than ever. But it was also there, latent, the fear of the future, the fear that everything they had built up would be destroyed, could fall apart at any moment. Camila felt that, although Paulo had been brave enough to open his heart, there were still parts of him that remained locked away, wounds that could not heal overnight. And deep down, she feared that those shadows would end up tearing them apart. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, Paulo stopped suddenly and turned to her with an expression of determination that Camila had not seen before. "There's something I need to do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Something I have avoided for too long." Camila looked at him with curiosity, but also with concern. "What is it, Paulo?" she asked, taking his hand, as if by doing so she could give him the strength he needed to continue. "I need to face my past," he replied, staring into Camila's eyes. "I need to go back to where it all started and close that chapter of my life. Because I can't move on with you, not completely, if I'm still carrying those ghosts." Camila felt a lump in her throat, but she nodded. She knew this was a step Paulo had to take for himself, and although the fear of losing him was present, she also understood that it was the only way he could be free of his pain. "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "I am here, and I will always be here, no matter what." Paulo embraced her, feeling Camila's love envelop him, giving him the courage he needed. That night, he decided to return to the place where he had lost everything, to the neighborhood where he had lived before ending up on the streets, to the house that had once been his home. Camila accompanied him, and together they walked the streets that, years before, had witnessed his downfall. Arriving at the door of his old house, Paulo stopped, feeling an avalanche of memories hit him hard. The pain of losing everything, the humiliation, the loneliness, it was all there, present, as if time had never passed. But this time, he was not alone. He took Camila's hand and squeezed it tightly, remembering that, despite everything he had lost, he had gained something much more valuable. The chance to start over. "This is where I thought my life was over," he confessed, his voice trembling. "But now I know it was just the beginning of something new. Because if I hadn't fallen, I would never have met you." Camila looked at him, her eyes full of love and pride. "Sometimes the most beautiful things are born out of the most difficult moments," she replied. "And you, Paulo, are proof of that." Paulo smiled, feeling the weight of his past begin to fade. In that moment, he made a decision. He would not let his past define his future. He would not allow the shadows of what he had been to stand in the way of what he could become. He turned to Camila, and with a sincerity that made his heart race, he said, "I want to move forward with you. I want to build a future, a home, a life that is ours. And no matter how hard the road, I will never let fear stop me again." Camila, with tears in her eyes, nodded, feeling her own heart fill with hope. "Then let's do it together," she said. "Because love is not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it together, one day at a time." And at that moment, Paulo and Camila realized that they had made the most important decision of their lives. It was not a promise of a perfect future, but a promise that, despite the obstacles, they would always choose to fight, always choose to move forward, side by side. The days that followed Paulo's decision to confront his past were like an awakening for both of them. The relationship between Camila and Paulo seemed to have reached a new depth, a connection that went beyond everyday words and gestures. However, Paulo knew there was something else he needed to do, a step he had not yet taken, but which had begun to take shape in his heart from the moment he decided to move forward with her. One afternoon, Paulo invited Camila to a special place, a small park hidden among the skyscrapers of the city, where fallen leaves covered the ground like a golden mantle. The sun was about to set, and the golden evening light bathed the park in a warm, nostalgic glow. Camila, curious, followed him, wondering why Paulo had chosen that place and that moment. "There is something I want to share with you," said Paulo as he took her hand, his voice full of emotion. "This is the place I used to come to when I was still living on the streets. Whenever I felt I couldn't go on, I would come here and watch the sun go down behind the buildings, reminding me that, despite everything, there was beauty in the world." Camila listened to him in silence, moved by the sincerity and vulnerability of his words. "I always wondered what my life would be like if I ever made it out of that darkness," Paulo continued. "And in my wildest dreams, there was always you. I never stopped imagining what it would be like to share my life with someone who would accept me for who I am, someone who would see more in me than a broken past." Camila felt her heart race, and before she could say anything, Paulo knelt down in front of her, pulling out a small ring he had kept for weeks. A simple ring, but full of meaning. It glittered in the evening light. Camila brought a hand to her mouth, unable to contain the emotion that filled her. "Camila," said Paulo, his voice trembling but full of determination, "you are the reason I found the strength to rebuild my life. You are my hope, my light, and I cannot imagine a future without you. I know that my past is complicated, and that there are days when my fears still haunt me, but what I do know is that I want to face it all with you. I want to walk with you, to share every laugh, every tear, every moment." Tears began to roll down Camila's cheeks, and with her voice breaking with emotion, she could barely whisper, "Paulo, will you marry me?" he finally asked, his eyes reflecting the same vulnerability he had felt that day in the alley when Camila found him and hugged him, giving him a reason to go on. Camila looked at him, and in that instant, all doubts, all fears, vanished. All that remained was the certainty that, despite the difficulties, despite the road ahead, she would always choose him. "Yes, Paulo, I want to spend the rest of my life with you," she replied with a smile that lit up the whole park. Paulo let out a sigh of relief and happiness as he slipped the ring on her finger, and as he did, he felt every broken piece of his soul finally come together. Camila embraced him, and in that moment, there was nothing but the two of them, sharing a love that had been born in the shadows, but now shone brighter than ever. The people strolling through the park watched them, some smiling, others applauding, but for Camila and Paulo, it was as if time had stopped. It was as if the universe was giving them its blessing, as if everything they had lived through had brought them to that precise moment. That moment when they could finally say they were complete. Paulo looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he felt that he had found his home. A home that was not a physical place, but a feeling, a love that gave him the strength to face anything. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he whispered, caressing her face. "Thank you for teaching me that even in the darkest of times, there is always a reason to go on." Camila smiled, and with one last kiss, they sealed the promise of a future together. A future they had decided to build despite the obstacles, despite the pain. Because in the end, they had discovered that true love is not the one that comes when everything is perfect, but the one that comes from the courage to face oneself and move on, choosing each other, again and again. The months that followed Paulo and Camila's proposal were filled with preparations for the wedding, but also with moments that reminded them of how far they had come. The ceremony was not extravagant or full of luxury, but it was a reflection of all that they had overcome. Surrounded by the few people who had truly been there for them through the toughest of times, they pledged their undying love to each other under the shade of a tree, the same tree that had witnessed their first reunion. Paulo, dressed in a simple suit, could not take his eyes off Camila as she walked towards him. Every step she took was a reminder of the sacrifices, pain, and struggles they had faced. And in his heart, he knew there was no one in the world who could understand him better than she did. Camila, for her part, felt like the luckiest woman in the world. In front of her stood the man who had learned to pick himself up again and again. The man who, despite the wounds and scars, had chosen to love her with all his soul. After the ceremony at the small reception they had organized, Paulo took the microphone and his voice full of emotion addressed those present. "Today I want to share something with you," he said, his gaze falling on Camila. My life was not always easy. There was a time when I had nothing, not even hope. But it was through an act of kindness, a simple coin given with sincerity, that I found the courage to move forward. The guests' eyes filled with tears as they listened to her story, and Camila felt her heart fill with pride. Camila taught me that true strength is not in never falling, but in getting up again and again, even when all seems lost, she said. He taught me that sometimes miracles happen in the darkest moments, and that true love is not about perfection, but about learning to walk together, despite the storms. Camila couldn't stop the tears from rolling down her cheeks as she reached out and took Paulo's hand. And I learned from you that second chances exist, she said, her voice breaking. That even when we feel we don't deserve to be loved, there is always someone who is willing to look beyond our scars. The room erupted in applause, but for them, at that moment, they only existed for each other. The promise of a future together was no longer a distant dream, but a reality they had built through effort, sacrifice, and above all, love. That night, while dancing under the stars, Camila leaned her head on Paulo's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for showing me that it was worth fighting for," he replied, gently stroking her back. As time went by, they built the life they had always wanted, a life full of happy moments, but also of challenges. There were days when Paulo's past came back to haunt him, nights when Camila's insecurities were present, but they always had each other. They supported each other, they stood up together, and with each passing day, their love grew stronger. One day, as they were walking through the city, they saw a young man sitting on the pavement with a blank stare and a hopeless expression. Paulo stopped, and Camila looked at him, knowing exactly what he was thinking. "This is our chance to give back what we were once given," he said, smiling. Camila nodded, and together, they approached the young man, offering him a hand, a word of encouragement, a hope. In that instant, Paulo understood that his story was not just about a man who had managed to stand up, but about the importance of sharing that light with those still trapped in darkness. And so, with every act of kindness, with every gesture of love, Paulo and Camila continued to build their future together, proving that the true lesson of life is not in moments of success, but in the ability to love and be loved, even when the scars of the past still burn. Because in the end, true happiness is found in the hands that reach out to help, in the hearts that choose to love, and in the courage to move forward, always. If you like this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. See you later.
If you like this story, take the opportunity to see the others that are appearing on your screen right now. Subscribe to the channel and comment on what you thought of this story. See you soon. Bye.